They were never supposed to survive this story as themselves, and that is the part nobody tells you. The world remembers the heat, the bodies, the whispered dialogue, and the scandalized fascination, but what it forgets or refuses to see is that 50 Shades of Grey was not a film franchise, it was a machine, and once it locked onto Jamie Dornan and Dakota Johnson, it did not care whether they came out whole. It only cared that the fantasy kept breathing, that it kept selling, that it kept consuming. And from the very first moment their faces were fused to that story, something irreversible began. Because fame doesn't arrive like applause. It arrives like possession, quiet at first, flattering, and then relentless, before the obsession, before the hysteria, before the way strangers would look at them as if they were unfinished business. There was nothing mythic about either of them standing on that casting floor in 2013. No destiny, no prophecy, just two people already carrying private weight. Jamie Dornan, a man who had spent years trying to step out of the shadow of modeling and into legitimacy, had just become a father. His world had narrowed, sharpened, become fragile in the way only responsibility can make it. Dakota Johnson, younger but no less burdened, was walking into every room with the invisible accusation of her surname already hanging over her head, aware that talent alone is never enough when the industry has decided you're an inheritance rather than an arrival. Neither of them was chasing fantasy. They were chasing stability. And that is exactly why they didn't see the trap forming. What audiences later read as effortless chemistry was, in truth, two people clinging to professionalism while standing at the edge of something they couldn't yet name. There was no fire at first. There was tension, uncertainty, a quiet calculation happening behind their eyes as they realized that this project, dismissed by many, mocked by critics before it even had teeth. It promised exposure on a scale that doesn't elevate but brands. Dakota would later admit they knew it would be big. What she didn't know, what no one ever knows, is that bigness doesn't expand you, compresses you. It takes every private insecurity and drags it into public ownership. When the first film landed, it didn't just open at the box office. It detonated. Overnight, the internet didn't see actors anymore. It saw symbols, archetypes, projections. Jamie Dornan ceased to exist as a man walking through the world and became a template. The controlled, dangerous, emotionally unavailable male fantasy millions had been rehearsing in their own minds long before the credits rolled. Dakota Johnson became its counterpart. Not a performer, but a vessel onto which confidence, submission, rebellion, and desire could be painted at will. And once that happened, there was no separating performance from person in the public eye. Every glance was evidence. Every laugh was interpreted. Every moment of politeness was repackaged as longing. This is where the story most people think they know begins. The rumors, the shipping, the relentless insistence that something must be happening behind closed doors. But this is also where the damage quietly accelerates. Because fame at this level does not ask who you are. It tells you, and if you resist, it punishes you by misunderstanding you louder. Jamie felt it first in the way people stopped listening when he spoke. Interviews ceased being conversations and turned into interrogations disguised as flirtation. No one asked about his craft. No one asked about his life. They asked about Christian Grey as if he were real, as if Jamie were merely the flesh delivery system for a character that had escaped the screen. He would later admit that strangers looked at him as though they already knew him, already owned him, already had claims on his silence, his restraint, his imagined darkness. The role followed him into airports, into restaurants, into the shape of the way women looked at him and men measured themselves against him. And the more the world leaned into that fantasy, the more he felt himself receding behind it. Dakota's experience was quieter, and in some ways more brutal. She was visible everywhere and understood nowhere. Applauded for bravery she did not feel. Celebrated for fearlessness she did not recognize in herself. Every red carpet became a performance layered on top of another performance, until she could no longer tell which expressions belonged to her and which belonged to the expectation. People spoke to her as if she were invulnerable, and that illusion denied her the right to admit how destabilizing it all felt. Anxiety doesn't announce itself in headlines. It shows up at night, in the body, In the moments when applause stops and you are alone with a version of yourself that no longer feels entirely yours. The cruel irony, the detail that transforms this from celebrity anecdote into psychological cautionary tale, is that they were acting out a story about control while slowly losing control of their own narratives. The public thought the danger was fictional. The real danger was invisible, because once the machine decided they were inseparable, their individual identities became inconvenient. They were no longer Jamie and Dakota. They were halves of a myth that the audience refused to release. On set, something unusual happened, not romance, not scandal, but alignment. When the cameras stopped and the noise briefly fell away, there was recognition. A shared understanding that neither of them could articulate without sounding ungrateful, dramatic, or unprofessional. They were inside something too loud to protest, and so they adapted. They formed a quiet alliance that the outside world would later mislabel as chemistry. It was survival, mutual containment, the ability to look at another person and know, without explanation, that they felt the same disorientation. This is where power dynamics begin to surface, not just between characters but between industry, audience, and self. Jamie publicly defended Dakota not because it was gallant, but because he understood the precision with which scrutiny cuts women differently. Praise became armor. Professional respect became a shield. Dakota, in return, learned to deflect, to soften, to protect him from questions designed not to inform but to provoke narrative collapse. And still, none of it was enough, because the myth was stronger than the truth, and the public prefers stories that confirm desire over ones that reveal cost. At home, the fracture widened. Jamie tried to re-enter normal life the way one returns from war. Present but altered. Fatherhood demanded grounding. Fame resisted it. Even in private, the noise lingered. Headlines followed him into the night, into moments that should have been ordinary. Amelia, his wife, became not just a partner but an anchor, watching as the man she loved wrestled with an identity the world insisted on assigning him. The more he scrolled, the more he wondered which parts of himself had been quietly traded away without his consent. For Dakota, there was no domestic refuge. Success isolated her. People assumed abundance meant fulfillment. They mistook access for peace. She walked into rooms filled with people who admired an idea of her, and walked out feeling more invisible than before. That contradiction, adored but unknown, erodes something fundamental. It teaches you that being seen is not the same as being understood, and that applause can be one of the loneliest sounds in the world. By the time the trilogy reached its final chapters, exhaustion wasn't just physical, it was existential. They had become efficient at smiling, expert at endurance, fluent in gratitude they did not always feel. The applause kept coming, but the silence afterward grew heavier. Jamie would later say that the experience gave them everything and took something back that could never be fully retrieved. That something wasn't privacy. It was simplicity, the ability to exist without interpretation. And this is the moment where part one truly tightens its grip, because what the audience celebrated as success, both of them experienced as erosion. The cost wasn't visible yet. The cracks were internal, but they were deepening. And what came next would force them to confront a question far more unsettling than fame itself. If the story was over, if the lights were about to dim, what exactly would be left of the people who entered it? By the time the world decided they were inseparable, Jamie Dornan and Dakota Johnson had already learned the most dangerous lesson fame teaches. Silence keeps you employed. Not truth, not resistance, silence. The machine that had lifted them into cultural obsession now demanded something in return, and it wasn't talent. It was compliance. Smile correctly, answer carefully, never disrupt the fantasy. Because the fantasy was no longer entertainment, it was infrastructure. It fed studios, headlines, algorithms, and millions of private projections that did not want reality interfering with desire. This was the phase nobody romanticizes because it doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like success, packed schedules, sold-out premieres, interviews stacked back-to-back until days blur into rehearsed anecdotes. But internally, something more corrosive was happening. Their identities were no longer evolving naturally. They were being negotiated in public. Every appearance became a referendum. Every pause, every shift in body language, every change in tone was analyzed as evidence of intimacy, tension, denial, or deceit. The truth that two people were trying to survive an abnormal level of exposure without losing coherence was the least interesting narrative available. And so it was ignored. For Jamie, the pressure manifested as fragmentation. He was expected to be grounded and dangerous, soft-spoken and dominant, emotionally distant yet endlessly available. These contradictions were not accidental. They were the fuel of the fantasy. But no human can embody contradiction indefinitely without paying a price. The more people projected Christian Grey onto him, the less room there was for complexity. Serious roles were reframed through erotic expectation. Interviews that should have explored craft were steered back toward sex appeal. And slowly, insidiously, his legitimacy as an actor became conditional on how well he continued to perform someone else's desire. Dakota's burden was different, but no lighter. She became the symbolic site where bravery was demanded rather than acknowledged. The industry praised her willingness to go there without asking what their cost her psychologically. The audience mistook endurance for empowerment. And the more she complied, the more composed she appeared, the more she laughed off invasive questions, the more the expectation hardened that she could withstand anything. Vulnerability became inconvenient. Fear became a betrayal of the image she was supposed to represent. This is where their dynamic shifted into something deeper than friendship and far more complex than romance. On set, they stopped trying to explain themselves to anyone else. It was inefficient. It invited misunderstanding. Instead, they learned to communicate in fragments, glances, timing, tone, the kind of shorthand that forms not through intimacy, but through shared threat. They were inside the same pressure chamber, breathing the same recycled air, aware that any visible crack would be amplified beyond repair. The public read this attunement as chemistry. What it actually was calibration. Two people adjusting themselves to survive a system that rewarded illusion and punished authenticity. When one faltered, the other stabilized. When one was targeted, the other deflected. Not out of loyalty to a narrative, but out of mutual self-preservation. They had become each other's witness in a space where no one else could be trusted to see them accurately. And yet, even this alliance had limits. Because while they protected each other externally, neither could fully escape the internal erosion. Jamie went home to a life that required presence, patience, and emotional availability, qualities Fame actively undermined. Dakota returned to solitude that magnified every doubt she wasn't allowed to voice publicly. The asymmetry mattered. It meant their coping mechanisms diverged. It meant relief for one did not guarantee relief for the other. And it meant that when exhaustion finally surfaced, it would not do so evenly. Interviews during this period reveal something subtle but telling. Their answers became cleaner, shorter, more controlled. Humor was deployed strategically. Praise was repeated with precision. These were not signs of comfort. They were signs of adaptation. When scrutiny becomes constant, spontaneity becomes risk. And risk, in an environment built on monetized intimacy, is not rewarded. It is punished. The tabloids, sensing fatigue, escalated. Rumors hardened. Questions sharpened. Why weren't they together? Why did they look distant? Why did they look close? Every possible configuration was interpreted as confirmation of something hidden. The truth that they were emotionally depleted and increasingly protective of what little remained private did not generate clicks. So it was rewritten as denial, tension, unresolved desire. The story consumed itself and they were expected to keep feeding it. There were moments, quiet, undocumented moments, when the weight became too heavy. Days when lines blurred, not because of attraction, but because emotional intimacy under surveillance creates confusion by default. When you are repeatedly told that your connection means something more, you begin to question your own perceptions. They spoke in whispers between takes, not to cultivate secrecy, but to ground themselves in reality. To remind each other that this was work, that the story had edges, that they still existed outside it. But even grounding has limits when the environment remains hostile. By the later films, the exhaustion had settled into their bodies. Not the dramatic kind that invites sympathy, but the chronic kind that dulls affect and narrows emotional range. They were functioning, not flourishing, enduring, not expanding, and the audience, mistaking endurance for ease, demanded more. This is the point where Part 2 tightens its psychological vice. Because W began as pressure was now becoming identity distortion. Jamie would later describe the sensation of losing track of where the character ended and he began, not as metaphor but as lived experience. Dakota would admit that being called brave felt absurd when terror had been her constant companion. These were not post hoc reinterpretations. They were delayed acknowledgments of a reality that could not be spoken while the machine was still running. And when the final film approached, something unspoken but unmistakable emerged between them. This could not continue. Not like this. Not without consequence. The intensity they had shared, the unrelenting exposure, the emotional labor, the years of being misread, had forged something real, but it had also consumed their capacity to stay inside it any longer. The ending of the trilogy was marketed as a culmination. Internally, it felt like a countdown, because when survival becomes your primary skill, freedom is not relief. It is disorientation, and that disorientation, the silence waiting on the other side of fame, was about to test them in ways the spotlight never had. When the noise finally stopped, it did not feel like victory. That is the lie nobody prepares you for. The end of the trilogy did not arrive with relief so much as dislocation, the kind that leaves you standing still while the world expects celebration. The cameras shut down. The premieres ended. The questions slowed. And in the sudden quiet that followed, Jamie Dornan and Dakota Johnson were confronted with something far more frightening than scrutiny: the absence of it. Because when your identity has been negotiated in public for years,